How about if you need 61 billion a month of interest payments, you cut 61 billion a month out of this stuff. End of story. If you default, it's on you. If you don't pay Social Security, it's on you, because this is simple math. This is like third grade addition, subtraction stuff, right? I think the average American can get this, but why aren't we teaching it? Why aren't we explaining this? Why are we saying, oh, we'll never default, and taking that as an assumption? Hey, it's Richard Matthews with Matthews Wealth Management, here to talk about the debt ceiling. It's all in the news. It's what they're talking about. There's a bill that's being debated. There are negotiations going on, and I'm going to chime in and tell you my opinion. So I'm going to hold off as best I can on the sarcasm, but it's going to be tough. Anyway, imagine that you're running a household. I'm sure it's easy to imagine. They can't really imagine that at government level, but you can. So let's get on their numbers on our basis. So if you have an income of $47,140, I just moved some zeros, by the way, from what our total tax receipts are per year, 4.7 trillion. And then we have our expenses of $61,293. You're terrible at managing money, right? Yeah, so goes on all the way up there. We're spending $6.1293 trillion per year. So if we, at our household level, spend $14,153 more than we earn, what do? Well, we take out a credit card, or we do some home equity loans or lines of credit. We borrow that money. Weird, it's the exact same thing at the federal level. So what they'll tell you, they being the economists, the smart experts in the world, will tell you that it's different for a government because, well, yeah, they can print money. So they can legally counterfeit. That's the rabbit hole I'm trying to avoid right there. But if we have $14,000 we have to go into debt to cover our yearly deficit, that's what that word means, is our shortage of income, technically, for our expense level, we roll that into debt, okay? So debt ceiling is think of your credit card that has a maximum amount that you can have on your balance. So currently, in this person's hypothetical household, the equivalent amount of debt that they've rolled up over the years has been $317,923. Moving out the zeros there, that's the $31.7 trillion debt that we have. Okay, so this is simple, but the numbers make it hard, right? The commas, I guess, make it difficult. So I wanted to show the relationship here of what we're doing this one year, 2023, 14.153 thousand is almost 5% more debt than what we've accumulated. So this isn't like a short-term, we always have a debt ceiling increase thing. This is an exorbitant increase in 1 year. Okay, just think about that. That's tremendous how much more debt we're doing. So just to give you an idea of the real world of debt, the $31.79 trillion of debt, and that's not counting unfunded liabilities, which I don't know if we really need to consider. That's like, hey, we got college and retirement down the road. But anyway, per taxpayer in the United States, each of us who pay taxes, which aren't that many, go look it up, we owe $248,000 of our net worth to old spending that the government did. Now, I didn't agree with that spending. I didn't get a vote in how we spent that money. My representative may or may not have represented me well at the federal level. But yeah, I don't, why am I owing 250 grand out of my savings for other expenditures? This is the theft, right? This is what's destroyed the middle class. Again, a rabbit hole, a rant. I'm going to avoid that. So let's continue. I just kind of wanted to show over time when we're looking at debt to GDP, right? So if you're the guy who needs to go put your excess spending on a credit card because, I don't know, maybe you think down the road you'll get a raise or start a business and make this huge money or win the lottery even, and therefore you'll pay this debt off later, right? But if you're that person one of the things that a credit card company or a loan company is going to look at is your debt to income, right? Okay, so everybody's familiar with debt to income. So we would look at that as debt to GDP as an economy, right? And GDP is a flawed statistic in itself. But hey, let's just look at it because it gives us a trend line to look at over history. In 1960, our debt to GDP was 52.9%. Think about what was going on in the 60s, right? And leading up to the 60s. And then what happened since the 60s that moved us into the 1980, our debt to GDP was 34.6. Hey, we did some good stuff there. I think stagflation was a part of that time frame, right? And we raised rates significantly and cut spending. Hint, hint. 2000, we're right back where we started in a post-World War II scenario at 57.9%. And hey, we hadn't really been hurt yet. Let's just keep going, right? So today, 120.5%. That's GDP, okay? That's not even what we're about to dive into. That's not even income, right? Because one thing I wanted to show here is our total GDP in our assumed situation here of the average household, 263,896 is total GDP, okay? So what the country produces in theory. It's a flawed statistic. But if that's the case, 47,000 of it is what the government's going to take out of that production to go spend where they want to. Now, they'll call that stimulating aggregate demand because demand creates production somehow. These idiots don't agree with Say's law that says that production precedes consumption, but that's why they're idiots. Yeah, I'm saying it. It's on camera. You're idiots. So anyway, the more we take out of GDP, does that help GDP? Does that help the overall situation of our debt and all? No, heck no. It's not a matter of income. It's a matter of expense, right? If I bring on a client that's somehow been allowed through the banking system to accumulate 317 grand of debt, and they're upside down every year by 14 grand, what do you think I'm going to tell them to do? Well, we're going to look at the budget, right? And so that's where we get into the debt ceiling discussion and who's holding who hostage ultimately here. It's going to be exactly what you think it's going to be, but hey, at least I'm saying it. All right, so year to date in 2023, the average monthly is what we're going to look at because, hey, everybody understands the monthly budget, right? You may not like doing them, but you understand them. Total receipts by the Treasury or IRS is $448 billion per month, okay? That's a lot. So when we're going to say, hey, we're going to stop paying Social Security if we don't get to debt ceiling discussion, come on. That's garbage. That's the gun to the head of the American citizen. Because our net interest payment is only $41 billion or $61 billion out of $448. Yeah, we could pay that, okay? Social Security, which they're holding you hostage on. They're saying that if you don't just authorize an automatic spend until we die scenario, we're not going to pay you what you're entitled to. That's their words, by the way. That's $128 billion. Well, that's easy to do. We could do that, right? 128 fits into 448 pretty easily. Veterans, hey, we might have to cut veterans benefits. Come on, you don't really have to because that's only $26 billion per month. Military, $47 billion per month. Food stamps, welfare, supplemental security, which is disability, all the stuff that the Democrats say we can't cut that. Okay, cool. I'm all for a social safety net, by the way. It's only $22 billion, guys. And actually, I would say that military versus welfare, that might be something to discuss. But if we look at the top 5, which is the equivalent of your budget, insurance, mortgage, utilities, clothing, food, the stuff you got to keep doing, $285 billion. So what's the stuff that we're unwilling to cut? It's $163 billion left over surplus after what I say is basic requirements of spending. So what would that be? I don't know, arts. We're going to study a lab rat that does something in the San Francisco Bay. Oh, that was a shortage of mice. Like all of these little pork projects that these people, representatives and senators, want for their districts and their areas, it's that crap we don't need. But you know what? If you don't give them that money, we're going to cut your Social Security. That's messed up, y'all. That's a hostage situation. In fact, I think we found a solution to this. And actually, I've got it on my phone, which is over here. So if we go back, let's go back to 2011, last time we had a debt crisis issue. Let's see. The scholar from Harvard Law School, his name is Lawrence Tribe. He's the dean of liberal constitutional experts. So I'm quoting this. So he's talking about debt crisis. And here's what he says. Quote, all this brings me to my second point. What is the government to do if, come August 3rd, by the way, that was in 2011, it does not have enough money to make all of the expenditures that Congress has required by law? The answer, I think, is that it must prioritize expenditures. Some payments simply have to be postponed until the Treasury has enough money to make them. Duh. It's what we do in our household, isn't it? If there's only so much money and you are determined not to run up your debt, what do? You make cuts. How do you make cuts? You change your priority of spending. Some bills get paid, some get left out there. Medical debt, that's a great example. Also, another person, and this is on the other side, this wouldn't be considered a liberal, although maybe a rhino is more appropriate. Mick Mulvaney from the great state of South Carolina. This was before he was in charge under the Trump administration. This was back in October of 2013, and he was talking about whether or not we were going to have another default and kind of what would happen. And he says, quote, we're not going to default. There is no default. There's an OMB directive from the 1980s, the last time we got fairly close to not raising the debt ceiling, that clearly lays out the process by which the Treasury Secretary prioritizes interest payments, end quote. So what are we arguing about? In fact, this is the opportunity of a lifetime for anybody that's conservative about finances and budgets and understanding you can't spend more than you create or earn or whatever you want to use there. Create is based in production, right? I'm a supply side guy. Anyway, so what does that mean? That means that when Janet Yellen says, oh, we haven't put any thought into how we're going to prioritize our spending, the question right in response is, why not? What have you been doing for the last 100 days when you said we're doing extraordinary measures to extend the debt ceiling? You should have been prioritizing, right? But God forbid they actually prioritize, because now this 163 is on the table. Now we can actually start doing real budgeting and deciding what needs to be paid and what is frivolous. All right, let's move on. So we passed, or I say we, the House of Representatives passed the Limit, Save, Grow, which effectively is meant to lower spending in exchange for raising the debt ceiling temporarily. Okay, is that going to solve it? Okay, let's go back into our monthly budget here, or normal household budget. That's the equivalent of $4,800. No, that didn't solve it. It's not even, I mean, it's maybe a third. It's a third of the problem, right, of our deficit here. But, and that's per year over 10 years. That's not even close to enough. So my question, back to the Republican leading people who came up with this, this thing that they actually got passed, I think that was probably a really smart move by McCarthy to get something passed, is it's not enough. And this is already a compromise, right? Like if the question is how do we solve the problem with debt ceilings and having a deficit that remains and growing our debt infinitely, right? Because nobody's serious about getting rid of it. Why wasn't our first negotiating point, how about if you need $61 billion a month of interest payments, you cut $61 billion a month out of this stuff. End of story. If you default, it's on you. If you don't pay Social Security, it's on you. Because this is simple math. This is like third grade addition, subtraction stuff, right? I think the average American can get this, but why aren't we teaching it? Why aren't we explaining this? Why are we saying, oh, we'll never default, and taking that as an assumption? And that's getting me more towards the next piece of this. Because every time we increase our debt, every time we have more interest we have to pay on what we didn't pay previously, a little rabbit hole rant here, we say we'll never default because the U.S. always pays its bills. BS. We don't pay our bills. That's why we're in debt. Okay? So every time we go more into debt, we're paying more interest on top of what we haven't already paid. And what does that do? That either raises the tax requirement, cuts the GDP, and then as we issue that debt, we monetize it, which means the Fed prints the money because it's not a surplus from taxes. Monetized debt is inflation. Where do you think the inflation came from? Government spending. What do you think COVID was all about? Government spending and inflation. Anyway, I'm trying to keep this short. I'm trying to get everything out here. But anyway, we've got this Treasury buyback in 2024. This is just on a personal note what I'm really struggling with here. Janet Yellen's Treasury Department came out with this notice that in 2024, the Treasury is prepared to do a big buyback facility. Why? Why in the world would we need to buy back treasuries? Well, you go to Investopedia, and Investopedia says, well, that's the way that they generate liquidity. No. If you're going to cut rates, pause rates, anything that's going to give a premium to the back end of the yield curve, why in the world would the Treasury issue or buy back bonds at a premium, right? Because if we're cutting rates, which is the going thinking and trend, which is most likely going into recession, there's no need for this. So they're expecting something to hurt the bond market. And cutting rates does not hurt the bond market, it helps the bond market. Maybe we can keep raising rates and crash all the banks in the financial system. I don't think that's likely. What else could cause the need of this? Well, a default would do it. If we actually defaulted on the debt, that would crush the bond market. What if we did a central bank digital currency? That would crush the bond market. What if another currency became the primary reserve? That would crush the bond market. What if there was a downgrade in U.S. credit because we're not getting our house in order? That would do it. So they're preparing for something that's going to cause a bond market correction, which we just saw a 20% pullback last year. And we've been at Matthews Wealth Management moving more towards the long end of the yield curve. That's got me thinking. You better be thinking if you're an asset manager. Lastly, we should default. Oh my gosh, why would you say that? Well, because it makes sense, right? Like here, we can pick and choose whether to pay that. I think we need to be very tactical with how we default. And so what ways can we default? We've defaulted twice, contrary to what they're saying. They're technical defaults, and then they're reasonable defaults, like on the gold standard. When we stopped paying international debt with gold and interest, that was a default. We had an agreement, and we didn't do what we said we were going to do. That's a default. We did another one in '74. So all of this has happened before, but what if in our choice of default, we said, hey, Federal Reserve, you bought up $5 trillion of U.S. Treasuries to bail out banks and to kind of keep this thing rolling as you printed money for PPP and unemployment and just put us further and further in this inflationary thing. You're not getting your money back, Fed. Who does that hurt? Well, initially, everybody will panic because nobody understands this stuff. Does it hurt me if I own bonds? No, because I'll get my interest. I'll get my principal. Does it hurt China or Europe or anybody internationally that owns our bonds? No, because they'll get their interest. They'll get their principal. Does it hurt insurance companies or pensions or banks or anybody else that relies on Treasury yield? No, they'll get their interest. They'll get their principal. The only people it hurts is the Fed. I don't care. I don't like the Fed. Let's default on that. That's $5 trillion of capacity. If we look at our overall $31.7 trillion, that we don't need to raise the debt ceiling if we choose to default, which we don't have to, but we do it to make a statement that, look, how useless and purposeless the Fed is. They created this money and this inflation for what? It's unnecessary. That's the solution. And nobody's going to talk about that because it's a little complicated, but this is not. This is incredibly simple. So that's my debt ceiling discussion. That's all the pieces of it that I'm focused on, that I'm looking at, and it's pretty simple, right? But the government's allowed to counterfeit, and I think that is the premise that everybody's operating under. It's time to question that. Should we be able to do that anymore? No. Don't raise the debt ceiling. Don't pay the Fed. There we go. Hope you have a good one. We'll see what happens next week.